Welcome to week 6. This week, we're going to be talking about sexuality. Sexuality has 5 main components. There's the physical aspect, which is concerned with the physical nature of sex, sexual health, and reproduction. There's the emotional aspect related to sex and the closeness it can bring with another person. There's the awareness of our sexual self and body, and the sexual self and bodies of other people. There's the power dynamic that often exists with sex and societal views of sex, and how it can be used coercively. Finally, there's the aspect of our internal and external identity that's related to whom we are attracted. We're going to focus on the last 2 aspects, identity and how power functions in relation to sexuality. There are a lot of sexual identities. We're going to cover many of them in the next module, but for now, these are some of the most common sexual identities. We have heterosexual people who are attracted only to the opposite gender, also known as straight. We have gay and lesbian people who are attracted to people of the same gender as themselves. We have bisexual people who are attracted to both binary genders, and pansexual people who are attracted to a range of genders. As with other identities, I'd like to examine the dominant identity first. Most people identify as heterosexual, and it is thoroughly normalized in our society. We have a wide range of acceptable behaviors for heterosexual people to display that are not available to those with other identities, as well as legal and institutional structures designed to benefit those in heterosexual relationships, particularly those who have entered into a formal legal partnership through marriage. But what if I were to tell you that the concept of heterosexuality was only a few centuries old? We've talked a bit about how strongly gendered labor didn't exist until later in the development of agrarian societies. The further definition and increased rigidity in what a man and a woman should be influenced the definition of the sexual relationship between men and women. Prior to that point, sexuality was about the act of sex. You were not identified by who you had sex with. That isn't to say that same-sex relations were considered acceptable in most cases. Having sex with someone of the same sex was still considered morally wrong, but there wasn't an identity attached to it. Marriages were less about love and attraction, and more about procreation and the raising of a family. Love may have existed in those relationships, but it wasn't the primary driver of those relationships. Beginning in the Victorian period, though, we started to get hegemonic ideals of masculinity and femininity, referred to in our texts as the cults of true manhood and true womanhood. The concepts of love also began to be wed to the idea of procreation, that we should love the person we have children with. There were also economic changes happening during this period as well, due in large part to industrialization. We began to move from a society where most people produced goods to one where many people were involved in other labor and purchased the goods they needed. This increased commodification leached into how we view our bodies. They were something that increasingly you could improve by purchasing the right clothes, accessories, and toiletries, and thereby making yourself more attractive. This commodification also included an increased concern for one's personal health. It was considered healthy to be able to control one's sexual appetites, and programs, potions, and special foods were sold to help people control their libidos. Relatively bland foods like cornflakes and graham crackers became popular for this reason. There were increasingly binaries in sexual health, what was normal and healthy versus healthy and abnormal. This was also a period when much of what was considered science included creating patterns of classifications for everything, from flora and fauna to the elements to human behavior. A German psychiatrist named Richard von Krafft-Ebing published a text in 1886 describing all of what were considered abnormal sexual behaviors. This is the first time the term heterosexuality is used, and is clearly what Krafft-Ebing considered normal sexual behavior. Anything that differed from standard heterosexual relations was classified as abnormal and catalogued. The turn of the century through the 1930s saw a rise in what Katz called the heterosexual mystique. This puts an emphasis on desire, and desire as a natural, almost mystical biological drive to procreate. Feeding this desire was considered natural and even healthy. This period also saw the rise in recognition of women as people with their own sexual desires. Previously, women were seen as asexual, repositories for men's desires. This is particularly captured in the archetypal flapper girl, who shook off Victorian norms for women's behavior and instead indulged in her own pleasure. Societally, this is linked to the first wave of feminism also. Women achieved the right to vote in 1919, and the movement that led to that victory established a new way of thinking of women altogether. There was a preoccupation with gender dimorphism as well. That is, that there are two very clear biological sexes with linked genders. Anyone who deviated from this was seen as not only deviant, but suffering from some sort of birth defect. The period after World War II brought a halt to women's progressive independence. During the war, women had taken on many typically masculine roles, particularly in the workplace. As the war ended, there was a push to return men to their previous position as breadwinner and patriarch. There was a new hegemonic heterosexuality that had an emphasis on procreation and the nuclear family. Sexuality that wasn't linked to procreation was considered abnormal, whether it was heterosexual or not. The post-World War II era also began to establish homosexuality as an identity. In keeping with the overall society value of procreation, homosexual people were considered sterile, lonely, and sad. Their deviance kept them from having proper families, and thus gays and lesbians were cast as tragic figures. At the same time, many LGBTGIs never returned to their hometowns, instead choosing to stay in coastal cities such as New York and San Francisco. They created communities and neighborhoods where they could live with relative safety, and created the conditions to birth the nascent gay rights movement. During this period, the sexologist Alfred Kinsey also began conducting his research on the nature of people's sexual desires. He was unique in that he differentiated sexual desire from sexual activity. What he found was there was a wide range of both sexual desire and sexual activity, not the binary of heterosexual and homosexual. He developed a 7-point scale as a way of expressing the idea of desire and activity as a spectrum. This research also led to the idea that desire is innate, that societal norms might affect sexual activity, but they did not affect desire at all. The late 1960s created seismic changes in societal views of sexuality. Counterculturalists preaching free love, the rise of second-wave feminism and the invention of the birth control pill, and the push for gay liberation all pushed back hard against the sexual constraints of the post-World War II view of the nuclear family and sex only in the context of procreation. Everything was up for questioning. The value of marriage, the structure of families, gender roles, the value of sexual pleasure, and the shaming of those whose desires and activities put them outside hegemonic heterosexuality. In a lot of ways, we're still in this era of examining sexuality and sexual identity. Many of our social issues right now boil down to a struggle between those who believe our views on sexuality were best in the post-World War II era, and those who believe there is a wider range of acceptable sexuality. Given the wide acceptance for same-sex marriage and different family structures, though, I believe that we're already at a point where the majority of people are relatively comfortable with a widened view of sexuality. As we explore gender more, however, the definitions of sexual identity are multiplying rapidly to try and accommodate our better understanding of the relationship of sex, sexuality, and gender. We're going to break those down next, but I believe this points to a shift in how strong of an identity sexuality will be in the future. We may soon be at a point where who you are attracted to is no longer a core part of your identity.